Okay, so with that little preamble, I'm going to get us started. Today, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, who will introduce our speaker for today. So, Liv Yoon is assistant professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and and her research examines the intersection of climate change, social inequities, and health, with a strong focus on community engaged work. She approaches climate change as a socio-political crisis and explores how it can be used as an opportunity to challenge structural inequities. Dr. Yoon completed her postdoc at Columbia University, during which she was a fellow with the New York City Panel on Climate Change and a member of the Columbia Environment Justice and Climate Just Cities Network. And I have to say, I had the good fortune of working with Liv on NPCC, New York City Panel on Climate Change, in the health chapter, and then in the energy and security chapter that Liv co-pioneered. So it's a great new contribution to that. So and hopefully we'll have Liv herself will be giving a seminar in over the summer, so at the very end of the summer. So welcome, Liv. Thank you so much for moderating for us. Alex, so thrilled. Alex is our postdoc, as you're about to hear. Really looking forward to today's seminar, and I encourage everybody to put questions in the chat as we go along. Liv, to you.
Great. Thank you, Deb, and thank you for having me here. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Dr. Alex Mikulas is a postdoctoral associate at the Center for Aging, Climate, and Health at the University of Colorado in Boulder in affiliation with the Institute for Behavioral Science. In 2024, Alex earned his PhD in sociology and community and environmental sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with an emphasis on geography and social demography. Alex is an applied spatial demographer, quantitative spatial data methodologist, and housing scholar. His research covers topics of spatial inequality, spatial demography, and socioeconomic well-being as they relate to ever-evolving dynamics in the U.S. housing landscape. His independent and collaborative projects examine post-2008 trends in racial segregation, the social capital implications of historical spatial exclusion, and residential mobility outcomes for housing subsidy voucher recipients, among others. So with that, over to you, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Liv. This is a pleasure to be here. And it's nice to see so many people have an interest in housing, which I'm really passionate about. And so I hope I'm able to share some good insight for everyone. I'm managing a couple different windows, and a couple things are going to open and close. And so if you see me clicking around, that's the reason why. And then the second thing I'll note is that I have some young kids who bring in germs to the house constantly. So I may need to clear my throat, so I apologize for the body noises that you may be hearing. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. Let me first start this, and then I will share a screen. Alrighty, so is everybody able to see kind of a shared screen, which just is a data slide or a presentation slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And move some of this other stuff over so I can also see what I'm doing. And I think we are good to go. So great. Thank you everybody for joining today. As mentioned, today is really just about looking into and digging into some housing data resources to be applied to aging research. And so really quickly, my name again is Alex Mikulas. We have heard enough about me already, so we will keep moving. The Center for Aging, Health, and Environment is an interdisciplinary and a joint effort by a couple of different institutions, really just to focus on research surrounding environmental change or disasters, aging adults, and health outcomes. As Deborah mentioned, it's a meant to be a hub for sharing resources and building community, in addition to facilitating ongoing research within the community at large. Yes, here's the actual language for cache. Let me go back here. Okay, so I am a spatial and social demographer by training, and also a housing scholar. So most of my spatial work and my demographic work looks at housing and housing landscape changes. I'm rather new to the to the health and environment world. And so today I'm going to be bringing in kind of a perspective on housing and housing data and different mechanisms within housing and how they can hopefully be integrated in a seamless way into existing environmental and health and aging research that kind of follows this general research framework where we have some environmental change or disaster that we're interested in. We have a population of interest, which are aging adults, and we have some health outcome that we're interested in kind of upfront and a priori before we start thinking about the role of housing. And so as, there we go, as we continue to move into thinking about housing and how it fits here, my job really is just to highlight where housing might fit within in different moments within this larger research framework. So with that, our roadmap for today, really we're gonna hopefully go over three main sections. The first is just a quick look at housing, a loose definition of what housing is and why we should care about it as environmental scientists and health and aging researchers. So we'll look at some frameworks and some loose definitions. Then we'll take three perspectives on housing, like three ways I think are useful to think about where housing fits in this larger kind of chain or framework for aging and health in a changing world. Within that, we'll look at some different questions to ask in these settings, useful data sources, and then I'll quickly highlight some case studies in each as well. And then finally, we'll go over some big picture takeaways. So mainly looking at common data challenges, as well as some ways to leverage your existing data environment and hopefully some future opportunities as well. I do have a lot of slides, so I'm going to skip around a little bit if needed. And Liv and or Julia, when it's about 1:35, will somebody tell me? That would be really wonderful and helpful. That way I'm not always keeping track of my own time. Alrighty. So really quickly, let's just talk about what is housing and why should I care? The biggest thing to think about today is that housing is much more than just tenureship or ownership or how much your rent costs, right? When we think of housing as housing scholars, it's really a field of study, or as a field of study, it's this web of interrelated concepts and phenomena that comprise the entire social, cultural, physical, financial, and locational experience of where we sleep at night, like where we put our heads down. So it's a much more holistic and rich view compared to a simple variable measuring, housing cost or ownership status. I like to think about it as the lived experience of homes, right? Beyond and within these kind of individual things we can think about with housing. In the cash research framework, and so that environment, aging, health framework, housing is especially important because it shapes a myriad social and health outcomes just in the general population. It's kind of one of the base points of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We all need shelter, and especially when the climate is challenging and extreme. And then for aging folks as well, there are specific physiological, cognitive, and mobility vulnerabilities later in life that a safe and secure home, a place where we can feel safe when we're in a vulnerable point in our life course, is just extra important in a world that is changing around us. So when we're thinking about housing from this broader perspective, the first point I'll make here is that housing is just fundamental to health promotion and health equity. So a lot of this perspective comes from Swope and Hernandez on a review piece, where they posit this framework, and essentially they articulate that housing inequality, of course, as we know in the U.S., is precipitated by some long-standing structural inequalities. And they secondly articulate that housing is much more expansive to think about than housing status and tenure. And so we think about things rather than just those simple notions. They break down housing into four features or four dimensions. The first of which is cost, which encompasses these typical things: our mortgage, our rent, our utilities, but also how much we're paying for insurance and how covered we are with insurance. A second might be then if we look forward to consistency, we're thinking here about whether or not folks are intermittently housed or they have housing precarity, if they have frequent moves, or if they have unexpected relocation events. The conditions of housing, this third point, can be things like the physical characteristics of the home, whether or not there's AC, how difficult it is to heat the home, the quality of the construction, whether or not somebody's unit is in a basement versus the third floor, all of these particular features of a home. And then finally, context. We can think about this as like the expanding surroundings um, around a home, things like neighborhood quality, nearby amenities or distance to healthcare services, rural versus urban context, community connection. So these larger parts that are part of the world around us, but our home is what anchors us to some of these things surrounding us that give our home some context. So this is a first framework for thinking about housing and health. And Swope and Hernandez articulate that any of these dimensions of housing, and particular variables that might fall within these dimensions, act as mediators and moderators for some type of health outcome later on. They, of course, consider as well the historical structures and things like that. But this yellow highlighted area is how we're thinking about measurements of housing, some dimension of or measurement of housing. And the second thing that is most helpful or the second framework that's most helpful for thinking about this in the aging and health and environment framework is that any weather or environment related pathway is moderated by housing at a particular moment in time, right? So Malinsky and Forsyth here are offering special attention to the role of timing for housing related moderators. Particularly, they think about how housing influences risk exposure before an event, sensitivity to some event during exposure to that event, and then a person or a household adaptive capacity afterwards, after the event. And so for Malinsky and Forsyth, we see that different features of housing play a role before, during, and after extreme weather events. Before, housing is able to help people be exposed or not exposed to the risk of an event. During, a house acts as shelter to protect from an event. And then after, housing offers some degree of adaptive capacity within that event. Oops. So as we're considering our research and as you're considering your research, let's see here. The things that you're coming to the table with already, right? Your exposure of interest or your consideration of the environment, your particular population of interest for many of us here as aging folks, and then whatever outcome of interest you might have, although that can change, but some of us also come in really caring about heart health or really caring about premature mortality, something like that. So you have these kind of three things you're already coming to the table with, and these three things should determine what critical dimension of housing you need to measure and how to measure it. They should also determine the appropriate period or timing to consider. So if we're thinking about pre, during, or post, and then they should also kind of inform the likely health impact pathway that housing is going to move through and shape some health outcome. And so we have a very simple diagram here. We have, in the context of some environmental change or disaster, we have some housing dimension that navigates through different timing and some impact pathway, usually again filtered through individual factors to arrive at some individual level health outcome for an individual. So let's take just quickly as an example extreme heat and think through the way that housing is going to move through these moments and what the implications are for the type of data that we might need for this particular question. So let's say we're interested in extreme heat. Our health outcome that we've kind of selected or we have good data on, let's say, is heat stroke. And we're going to move backwards now. So how do we think about extreme heat and heat stroke? What's going to influence this pathway to heat stroke? The first is that we know that sensitivity during the hottest part of the day, like during the exposure, is very important. So we need to think about measuring things during an exposure. And then we need to think about what housing dimension is going to maybe be most protective here. And so let's use the example of air conditioning. And so within this setting, we have our condition of housing, our housing dimension or condition would be a condition, a physical condition of the home. It's going to impact our heat stroke or our health impact during the event via moderating or mediating how sensitive one is to the heat that's occurring outside. And it's going to then go through and have some moderating effect on one's health for a heat stroke. As you all can hear me talking about this, you can hear that I'm not a public health scholar or a doctor, so do forgive some of my step-up language. We can continue to think about this using a completely different health outcome or health adjacent outcome. So maybe being removed or separated from one's social support. Again, this is an important health outcome when we're thinking about heat or environmental change. And we know that being removed from or being removed from a social setting or social support due to a disaster is based on somebody's adaptive capacity after the event. How well are they able to remain in place and weather that event, or does it push them over the edge and have to remove them from their home, make them maybe move to a different part of the country where they're not exposed to such types of environmental exposures? And so we can think about this maybe from a perspective of utility costs with extreme heat. And so in this case, we're not necessarily looking at the condition of the home, rather we're looking at the cost of utilities in a rising temperature, in a world with rising temperatures, right? And so maybe they do have air conditioning. That's not a problem, but they can't afford to run air conditioning for the entire hot summer rather than the 1 or 2 weeks where air conditioning is really crucial. So in this setting, our housing dimension, our impact pathway are very different. So here we have cost that's going that we need to consider after the event, or in this case, after we start to see prolonged changes in heat. This cost is impacting somebody's adaptive capacity to remain in place with their social support, and they're experiencing an unexpected or unwanted displacement. They have to move to a different place that's less expensive. I don't need to go through this one, but we can also think similarly. We could do a whole bunch of examples, but what I want to highlight here is that this web can get a bit complex, right? We can think about how many different dimensions of housing are working at many different temporal points and through many different impact pathways to impact or shape some type of health outcome. And when I think about all this, I kind of think about this wave. I feel a little bit overwhelmed. I feel like there's a lot going on in a slide like this. And a little bit, I get a little bit overwhelmed, like I'm kind of in the ocean in the middle of nowhere. And so I want to take a step back away from these thinking about specific things, and I want to actually move to 3 more simple ways to consider housing and how it is moving through these moments to impact health. And when we work through each of these ways, this is where we'll get into some of the data sources, some of the other ways to approach, common ways to approach this type of work. So based on all of these things we've chatted about, the first thing we can kind of pull away, the first, get to the right slide, so make sure I'm not, yeah. So the first kind of pathway and broad theme that emerges is that housing serves as a privileged location that can shape people's risk. The key housing dimensions here are existing social stratification and housing market forces. The second is that housing serves as a protective shelter that can shape event severity, right? So the key housing dimensions here are those characteristics and qualities of the dwelling unit or the hyperlocal context that the unit is in. And then finally, this third broad pathway is that housing serves as an economic resource that can shape recovery after an event. And so the key dimensions here are the types of financial relationships and financial leverage that people have access to that are often related to their housing tenure, but not just housing tenure. So each of these 3 pathways and broad themes, they focus on a particular housing dimension or housing features and particular timing for that impact pathway, right? They also each have a specific data structure and data infrastructure demands, and they also inform our particular type of outcome. And so the rest of the time today, we're going to kind of go over these three categories, these three bins, from a more holistic perspective, and look at the type of questions and data, questions we can often ask, and data that we might need to use for addressing these things. So for the first one, housing markets, we're going to focus on housing markets and how markets stratify risk exposure. So for here, we're thinking about how housing functions as a privileged location that shapes risk before an event, right? And so our timing here, we're focusing on before, where people are in different places and what that means for their risk to some environmental event. And we know this because housing markets, we already know that they stratify people and stratify social groups into high and low risk geographies. So stratify into different floodplains or areas of flood risk, different firescapes. And they also stratify people into high or low risk housing dimensions. And so whether it be types of units like basement units, which are less expensive, units that maybe don't have as many amenities like no AC. Housing market also stratifies people into places with different types of insurance coverage, different structure types, often into different group quarters and different forms of housing tenure. All of the way that folks are stratified is largely based on existing social stratification and existing social inequality. And so the outcomes here that we can think about are really just being able to identify who is at risk of some type of event. The type of question that we may want to ask is, who is currently at risk of some likely disaster or environmental change? How can we measure that? How can we identify where they are and be kind of sure we know who's where and what type of risk they might be exposed to? So some of the data requirements here are that you need to map and identify risky places. So typically you're using spatial data. You also need counts of people within those risky places. So in our case, maybe we're counting just folks who are in a certain stage of life. And then also, if you're able to, you can stratify counts by more or less risky types of housing characteristics. And so maybe you want to understand how many aging folks are living in mobile homes versus single family units in a floodplain, or how many aging folks are living in group quarters versus single family homes, et cetera. And then you could also think about how the risk of exposure might change in the future. And so the data and methods requirements here are also related to or often utilize small area population projections. So I'm going to shout out to my applied demographers who are very good at this small area estimation. And then also we take into account housing market trends in cost and in building and in buybacks, where different levels of affordability and desirability based on climate changes are driving cost and structuring people again and stratifying people again into high and low risk places. So we have some great case studies that highlight this. I'm going to just briefly chat about each of them. Winkler and Mockran have a very recent piece that was written about on our CASH website as well, really just identifying how people in high risk or high wildfire risk areas, how they tend to be aging in place, and the aging populations are at a greater risk to wildfire because they are locating and remaining and aging in place in these areas that are increasing in their risk exposure to wildfire. There's another great piece from some colleagues at CU Denver who took a look back at recent floods in Colorado and identified where mobile home parks were in relation to these places that flooded and then have future risk, and the demographics of folks in mobile home parks and their subsequent future exposure risk to additional flooding. And then finally, we have a piece here by McCarthy and Friedman, who look at disaster preparedness and housing tenure. And so they're looking at somebody's risk of experiencing a disaster, but then also how housing tenure influences their ability to prepare for and weather that disaster before it happens. also a huge emerging literature on climate gentrification. And so these are market responses to perceived or anticipated environmental change. And there are a lot of implications here for further stratification of risk, right? If everybody wants to live in safe places become much more expensive, or low risk places become much more expensive. And there are implications for who then is left to live in the riskier locations. Um, and additionally here, we can also think about this as aging in place. And so many folks are living right now with golden handcuffs. If anybody's familiar with this term, they're folks who are aging and in their retirement years are living in these big homes that they bought that are paid off. But these homes also tend to be in high risk areas, and they tend to have a harder time to being sold when people are aware of the risk of these types of homes. And so we can think about golden handcuffs in this sense that are purely financial and market driven, but these may also turn into climate handcuffs where folks are also less willing to move into spaces that are of high risk, and it's allowing or kind of structuring aging people into these high risk areas with maybe a large home asset, but also at much greater risk to some climate vulnerability, particularly wildfire. When we're thinking about this housing as a privileged location, the useful data sources, hopefully everybody has some familiarity with the US decennial census and the ACS aggregated tables and public use microdata. There's a lot of really wonderful data here that allows you to put people into place, right? And stratify them by some characteristic, some social characteristic. I'll remind people that the survey in the American Community Survey and the decennial census are both censuses and surveys of people and of households and housing characteristics. And so when you think about a count of a person, the census also is always putting them in a place and counting what their home is like around them. And you can look at tables that put people into different types of homes and in different geographies. There's also data that we consider if we're thinking about future casting and who might be at risk based on changing market trends. There is a lot of data from the FHFA on repeated sales data and housing price indexes. And then you can also get into county and municipality transaction record data to look at changing home prices and where homes are becoming more or less costly over time. And finally, on a state-by-state basis, usually you can look at home insurance data and look at where home insurance rates are spiking, whether or not they relate to increasing or changing climate vulnerabilities, and then who's moving in and out of those spaces as a result. There's a lot of really great emerging work out of that setting. And then, of course, for most of this work, we need some type of geography of risk exposure, right? So we can use FEMA or wildfire risk. Chirps and Chirps, the Cache website has a lot of resources on many of this. Alrighty, the second kind of broad pathway I want everybody to think about is that housing conditions serve as shelter during an event. Housing is a protective force during an event. This is a rather common approach in the housing health exposure research field, and it's just looking at some characteristic of a home that's protective to some health outcome, and it's a rather straightforward, in theory, straightforward way to think about how homes can be protective or helpful. Here, with the outcomes we're thinking about are like the immediate health impacts of some exposure, or in many cases, mortality during exposure, or often secondary mortality that happens as a result of the exposure that happens. So secondary mortality being hospitalization during an event, and then maybe that was the inciting moment towards a health decline and then ultimate premature mortality. The types of questions we're asking here are again pretty simple. They're what features of a home predict some positive health outcome for an aging population in the setting of some climate or environmental disaster or change. The data requirements here, this is where things get tricky, right? We need individual level data. It should be longitudinal. It should be very spatially explicit to capture whatever risk or environmental risk you're looking at or environmental exposure you're interested in. And you also need detailed record or observation level housing characteristics that are germane to the health outcome that you're interested in. And so the relatively straightforward kind of moderating or causal chain you're thinking about is actually a very difficult data ask. It's a data lift that's really heavy. This type of comprehensive data is typically rare, right? You have the health data or you have the housing data, and linking these two is notoriously difficult.
Alex, quick time check. It's 12:35.
Great, thank you. So some case studies that do this type of work well. There's one by Katz, Brown, Giannakis, and Stahl. It's a recent one. And they're looking at air conditioning and mortality in Toronto nursing homes. Pretty straightforward. Nursing homes that have air conditioning have a lower likelihood of deaths at that residence during those 3 days before and after the window of 3 days before and after a high temperature day, an extreme temperature day. And so nursing home units without AC are more likely to observe deaths during these extreme temperature windows. There's also a lot of really wonderful work emerging out of the Texas winter storm Uri setting that happened a couple years ago. This is emerging research. When I share these slides, I'll have some additional links to some of these pieces. I wasn't able to link out to explicit ones here. And then we can also think about there's this idea of energy insecurity, which is another way that people weather and react to and are able to kind of have a less severe experience in a storm, is if they're able to keep their power on, right? And so sometimes there are environmental things like this storm in Texas that knocked out power, but other times it can be extremely cold and you don't have the finances to keep your home warm enough. This is a form of energy insecurity that can have some pretty clear and explicit health implications. Some useful data sources here if we're thinking about this, needing this like really comprehensive data. One thing to think about would, if you have comprehensive health data, but you need housing data, one thing to maybe consider would be local assessor data and parcel housing parcel data. This is super granular and detailed. It's longitudinal. You can scale it up or aggregate it to whatever you need to. And so if your particular data set, if you're using restricted data and have addresses or lat long for your respondents, it is in theory possible to link your respondents to parcel data that actually give you an insane amount of detail on the characteristics of the home or of the structure that they're living in within the parcel. And so the challenges here that we might have with parcel data are that there's a lot of geographic inconsistency in how this data is collected and stored. And so how Boulder County, Colorado grabs their parcel data, stores it, codes it, could be very different than the county next door, than the Denver County data. And so you're typically restricted to, unless you're willing to do the repeated data cleaning for multiple counties or an entire state, you're restricted to a smaller geographic area. There are commercial data aggregators that try to do this work for you. It can be pretty expensive, and it's also a methodological black box. And so if you have the ability to go to the source, go to Boulder County, go to Denver County, and get their parcel data and merge it in with your health survey data, that would be the way to do it. But the data lift is pretty extensive there. And then finally, if you're really a brave person, you can think about using the census environment and merging some of your work or some of your existing data to existing census data products that have the type of housing variables or characteristics that you're interested in. And so the census has this linkage program, this data linkage program. They use a couple different things. Often it's personal identifier keys or PIC IDs. They have a master address file that helps to link people to addresses. And then they also have a Numident ID file, which is related to, I believe, maybe Social Security payments or IRS, like some tax identification as well. But either way, if somebody exists in a survey in the US Census, you can hypothetically link to them and to their individual level information from that survey based on a PIC ID or master address file or a numinant ID. If they're captured in any census, any survey, particularly the American Housing Survey, you should be able to do this. And then you're merging your survey data with individual level US Census data. You're using these census tools like a PIC ID, or you can supplement with probabilistic record linkages. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, particularly about how it's very difficult but doable. Alrighty, and then really quickly, this final pathway for how housing can shape health in a changing environment is that housing economics can shape how people recover from some disaster or weather ongoing environmental change. So housing serves here as an economic resource that shapes recovery or resilience. When we're thinking about housing in this setting, we're not necessarily thinking about if it has AC or where it is necessarily, but rather we're thinking about housing as a series of financial relationships, right, that provide leverage or liability in a moment of crisis. And so housing as an economic asset can either excuse me, I lost my place. There we go. Yes, I already said it. It serves as leverage or liability in these moments of crisis. And so the outcomes we're thinking about here, rather than explicit health outcomes necessarily, we're often thinking about one step removed from some explicit health outcomes. So we're thinking about unwanted displacement after disaster, or a healthcare disruption because one had to move locations. We're also thinking about loss of social support. If somebody is moving, or if their social support around them moves due to a disaster. We're thinking about things like financial burden of recovery and rebuilding a home. And then we can also think about secondary health impacts, things like the stress or mental health load that's associated with these types of challenges during recovery. And so some questions to ask here would be, what types of housing factors predict post-disaster residential relocation? That could be one way to consider it. You could ask a question like, do certain housing factors protect against long-term stress and mental health challenges after a disaster? The type of data requirements one would need here would be individual and longitudinal or possibly retrospective data. And then you need, instead of detailed housing characteristic data, you need detailed housing finance data, right? Or housing individual level housing economic data that's germane to the type of resiliency or recovery outcome that you're interested in. So some case studies here, I've lumped a whole bunch of them together actually. So there's an entire body of literature on the Hurricane Katrina diaspora. So who was dislocated from their community during and after Hurricane Katrina, who was more likely to go or come back, and how folks' housing finances and housing circumstances predicted this type of relocation or healthcare disruption. And so Horry and Schaefer have a really kind of foundational piece on that. And then Dr. Beth Fussell and Dr. Jim Elliott are two of the many folks who have just done a lot of work thinking about Hurricane Katrina and how housing and folks' housing economic status shaped whether or not they were able to weather their storm and remain in the place they wanted to remain in. Dr. Anna Rhodes and Dr. Max Besbris, two friends and colleagues of mine, have a more recent book called Soaking the Middle Class, which is looking at a similar phenomena from Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And they're focusing on the role of insurance coverage here. So insurance coverage, again, is another economic relationship that is very explicitly related to housing. And they look at how insurance coverage offers protection against financial hardship, against relocation, against the ability and desire to rebuild or to kind of pick up and move. As we could maybe imagine, what they find is that this is a much more complicated story than whether or not you have insurance, but they very much so highlight the importance of financial relationships and financial leverage that one has after weathering some type of event. And then this Leetle and Bentley piece, I just included it in here. It's a really wonderful example of like a matched case control study for some big environmental exposures in Australia. So in the name of time, I'll get past that. In this setting, the types of data sources that we're looking at are post-disaster surveys, if you have them. Qualitative studies and interview methods. A lot of folks look at residential mobility data when they're looking at disaster resiliency. If you're more interested in that, come to the April 23rd CASH seminar. That's explicitly what we're talking about, so I'm not going to touch on it here. And then if you're able to and have the skills, some quasi-experimental or pre-post treatment designs are useful in these settings. Yeah. Alrighty, I'm going to quickly go through big picture takeaways, and then I hope to have about 12 or 13 minutes to have some Q&A. So the first thing we'll go through here is just a sample of some existing health and aging surveys. Then I'll talk about some current data problems and data challenges, how we can leverage some existing data, and then some opportunities for new data collection. So I wanted to just quickly highlight some housing modules in like commonly used health and aging surveys. And so the HRS has their section 8 is their housing module. And oops, mute. For some reason it muted me. All right, is everybody able to hear me? Okay, cool. So I was going to push out to kind of show what each of these housing modules look like and the type of data in them. I think I'll pass on that. We can go look at it together in the Q&A if we want to. All that is to say, the HRS has extensive data on housing, and it's all record level data, and much of it is housing economics data, like what's your mortgage rate, what's your mortgage outstanding balance, what's your mortgage like what's your principal, like everything you could ask about any mortgage detail, any rent detail, any utility cost detail. They have that for like first, second, and third homes in the HRS. So it's a really great thing to think about, especially if you're wondering about the role of housing for resiliency, because there's a lot of those economic data. The NHATS has another really wonderful couple modules for housing variables, mainly related to like functional limitations in aging and housing. So whether or not there is a lift on the stairs, whether or not there's a ramp to get up to the front door. But there are other kind of clever and creative uses of some of those variables, I think, that one could use if you're already using the NHATS data. And then the PSID also has a really great smattering of housing and housing related data that fall in each of these cost, consistency, characteristic, and context variables. I also wanted to point out, just from some of my digging, there are some really great this is the CDC's National Post-Acute and Long-Term Care Study, or NPALS. But this is similar types of data for folks who are living in facilities rather than folks who are living in single family homes or they're living independently. And this has some great data about where people were living and what their housing conditions were prior to ending up in an LTAC or an RCC. And so a great way to think about housing's protective or predictive force into certain types of later life living situations. And then there's also Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services data. So there's nursing home provider data and Medicare fee-for-service claims data. We can talk about those in the Q&A. Alrighty, so the primary data challenges that we're going to run into with most of this type of work is just siloed data, right? It's health data is often individual level and administrative, and it's missing housing data, and it's often missing useful linkage variables unless you're using restricted data. And then on the flip side, housing data is often aggregated. It's often unstandardized if it's not aggregated. And there are great surveys and useful detailed survey instruments that have a lot of housing data, but they need linked to health data, right? And we all know that data linking is a really, really major undertaking. Every time I try to think about doing this or think about doing it in a different way, you always have to ask the question of, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Because you need extensive use of restricted data. You often have to have access to an FSRDC, a Federal Statistical Research Data Center, and the methods are often really complex to do this linkages, but it can be really worth it. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this part. Alrighty, and then it's important also to talk about what we can do with our existing data. And so you need one thing to consider is, what's my data what's my level of geography for the data that I have, and can I link it with relevant housing data? And so if I have an address, maybe I can link it with parcel data. If I have just census tract or county, how are other ways I can consider housing in these moments? And then also, if you're using survey data, go fishing for other types in other modules that you're unfamiliar with to see if they have the types of housing data that may be useful. So a lot of the socioeconomic status or income modules often have housing submodules within them. So yeah, get creative and go snooping around, because you may be surprised at what you find. And then another data opportunity is just for new data collection. And so if you are in a position to collect new data, include relevant housing variables in your search. So housing status and economics, consider things like structured characteristics, and always, if you're able to, collect lat long or residential addresses. Yeah, so if you're collecting data, can you add a housing supplement if you're in ongoing collection? And then also, we can consider this data, or this parcel data linkage that I was talking about earlier. You can consider doing that on the back end, and then delocating everything once you get the housing structure characteristics that you're interested in, before you publish the data that you have. So you kind of delocating your records, but with very specific locational data within them. Let's see here. Yeah, there are great. Another data opportunity again is these census data linkages, but we do know the challenge of them. I encourage everybody to look at Matt Grates's work. He's at Minnesota now, but he has some really great work that is very, very steeped in these data record linkages. So you can see the possibility and potential, and especially any possibility and potential for linking to the American Housing Survey, which has thousands of variables that are very specific to how people experience their homes, and it has a bunch of great disaster modules as well to it. So if you can link to it, that's a great one to link to. We've talked a bit about parcel data linkages, so I'm gonna skip this. And yeah, I also want folks to consider qualitative work. I am not a qualitative methodologist, but every good idea I get comes from a qualitative research study that I read. And so consider the type of things you can learn from qualitative work, and also like an opportunity to examine some of these things that are less measurable, right? The social and cultural dimensions of housing and their importance there as well. I spoke for a long time, so I'm going to just do a quick thank you to the folks here on the screen. I know everybody has questions. I'm going to get a drink of water, and we can chat from there. I'm gonna stop sharing, and I can always share again if I need to.
Great. Thank you, Alex. That was really informative. Thank you very much. Yeah, and please get a drink of water. It does sound like you need some. All right. I also appreciate that shout out to qualitative research afterwards. All right, so we have a few questions here. Just mindful of the time, so I'm going to pick and choose what I think are questions that can be combined. The first one, there's a question and a comment here about doubled up populations. So imagine those who are staying with family or non-family because they cannot afford their own housing. For populations like that, what would where would you go for data sources? Does that even exist? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a really great question. So this is the type of population who is housing precarious. And housing precarity is just historically very, very difficult to capture and to measure. I think one way I would go about this is through the qualitative route. And so if these types of folks aren't accurately captured in the data that quantitative data that we have, the best route is through qualitative work. That would be my first suggestion. And then yeah, there are some surveys. So the American Housing Survey has a lot of questions about who you're living with, and if it's if it's a regular living arrangement or if it's something that is temporary. But again, that data is very siloed and not connected to a lot of the health outcome research that we're maybe interested here.
Okay, great, thank you. Separate question, are mobile home parks at greater risk? of all types of disasters, not just heat? And are they underrepresented in the censuses of populations and housing or the surveys like ACS that are derived from those enumerations?
Um, so yes, good, really, really good question. It seems to be that mobile homes are uh, largely at greater risk for disaster exposure. Um, it depends on the type of exposure, right? So a lot of this is like health outcome and exposure dependent, like I mentioned at the beginning. But largely, mobile homes are typically of um, lower construction quality uh, than apartment complexes or single family homes. So they have like less insulation protection. They don't stand up to wind very well. They do not make it through tornado events very well at all. And so in that sense, yes, they're at a greater risk. They're often less expensive, and so they're located in parts of town that we know people are already filtered into high and low risk based on SES in housing costs. And so they are at higher risk for those reasons, but they're not underrepresented especially in American census data and ACS data. You can, for most data that you might be interested, you can slice and dice based on mobile home versus every other type of housing um, type. I think that especially many of the housing surveys and rental surveys over sample from types of more precarious or lower income housing circumstances to capture these moments of vulnerability. Um, so yeah, that's a really great question, but that's one place where the quantitative data is actually I think rather reliable, or at least it's not non-existent.
Okay, great. All right, with 3 minutes left, I'd also like to see if anybody would like to ask a question directly here and come off mic. Otherwise, I have one last question. Okay, if not, maybe as a wrap-up question for you, Alex, and something you mentioned. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I actually recognize some names here of folks who are as well. And as you said, for even doubled up populations, what um, might you have in mind, or some suggestions for others of what like a mixed methods or like a mixed approach study would look like that combines quantitative and qualitative data here?
Yeah, they really that's a great question. That's like a nice, let's imagine what we could do if
Yeah,
we
streamed.
could
Yeah.
do what we wanted to do, right? Um, yeah, again, so much of this is dependent on what your interest is, right? Like what your outcome is and what your exposure might be. I think that there's some really neat work coming out of some cash affiliated teams at CU Boulder that are looking at they're doing interviews with folks after experiencing a wildfire, and so they have a lot of pre-data, quantitative data about who was exposed to this type of disaster, what their conditions were before and during, and afterwards. Now they're going into some of the qualitative and interview work to learn a bit more about people's experience of the disaster. I would approach that um, from a perspective of like, how was your home helpful in this setting, or how is it a liability? And then I also would think about something that you can't really measure with numbers is like the social impact of perhaps losing your home or being displaced or losing all of your neighbors' homes, but you were left there. Um,
Yes.
the 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 impact to the community, the impact to one's kind of connection to place and to um, yeah, that would be the way that I think I would approach it, is using some of the qualitative work to target those post interviews, right? Post disaster or post exposure interviews.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Thank you,
yeah,
Alex.
that's off the top of my head. I'd love to talk more.
Okay, Deborah.
So sorry, I see we have a late breaking question from one of our attendees who asks, I want to combine census data and survey data. However, the survey data is spatially one higher level courses. municipality versus district? What method is solid in joining these data types? Thanks. So I don't know if you have a quick answer, but if you don't, Alex, since you said you were going to be like adding some more links and so forth to your slides,
Yeah.
maybe that's an opportunity to also address like some of the
Yeah.
linkage, some of the linkage issues.
Yeah. So the good part to this question is that this can be a rather straightforward spatial data science, like some GIS processing that can do this multiscalar. You're hopefully aggregating up versus trying to disaggregate out, but there's a way to do both, and both are possible. Um, yeah, I'd love to talk more, Maximilian, if you want to stick on later. I don't need to leave right at 2, so if other people just want to hang out, I'm happy to stick around. And
Great.
then yes, Deborah, I'll also add some more resources to these slides before we send them
Great.
off.
Okay.
Great. Excellent. Thanks.
Like that, Deborah.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Liv. Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you.